Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on looking at the role of removals to meet net zero targets. So we're very excited to be part of here today, and we just have some housekeeping rules before we get into some very in-depth and very interesting discussions, because when we think about it, removals are really important to actually meet net zero targets. This is something that's been pointed out by both the IEA and the IPCC. And what we really want to understand is the role of the carbon markets in helping scale investments into these types of technologies. Given that it's very hotly debated, and we want to take advantage of that by making this as interactive a session as possible. But in the beginning, you as attendees will be on mute. If you do have a comment or a question, please use the question function in your control panel. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact us directly. And for questions related to the presentations, we would like you to refer to the Q&A session at the end. Don't worry, I'll make sure to bring these questions up as best we can. Now, this webinar is recorded, and so it will be sent to you within the next week. And before we go on, I just want to say there's always some technical hiccups one way or the other because we're all broadcasting from our homes. So please bear with us if that happens. So, hi, I'm Maria Carvalho. I'm a senior consultant at South Pole in our climate policy and carbon pricing team. And on this discussion about the role of removals technologies to net zero targets, we have an extremely exciting group of people coming from different walks of life. So we have Patrick Bürgi, who is the co-founder of South Pole and is in charge of strategy and business development as South Pole's innovation director. Then we have Misha Repman, who is a senior environmental manager at Swiss Re, driving the design and implementation of the group's carbon net zero program. After him, we have Adam, who is currently engaged in the development of nascent greenhouse gas removal sector, providing advisory support to organizations seeking to develop climate strategies in actually effectively tackling climate change at the Carbon Removal Center. And last but not least, we have Simon Henry, who is going to give us a wrap up. And so Simon is the Director of Carbon Market Development at the International Emissions Trading Association, and he leads IETA's work to advance the private sector's engagement in natural climate solutions and reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. So thank you, everyone, and welcome to the panel. If we can go to the next. So our agenda is a run through of the speakers I've just discussed. After that, we'll actually have polls to get some insights from all of you and to see where this balance is in this space between removals technologies in the future net zero world. And then we'll go on to the Q&A. All right, Patrick, I'm leaving it up to you now.
Thanks a lot, Maria. So I'll start by setting the scene a little bit and giving an intro to net zero and what that means in terms of removals. These are probably the two hottest topics of the last year, I think, in carbon markets. But we also still see, I think, a lot of confusion and debate around these two terms. So I'll start by giving a bit more background and shedding some light into our understanding of these terms. So starting with net zero, so where does that come from? Actually, the term started becoming really popular after the IPCC report on 1.5 degrees warming. And there, for the first time, the IPCC actually coined this term of net zero. And the different IPCC scenarios all pointed to the fact that we will have to get to zero emissions at some point in time, with the average scenario pointing towards 2050 as that point in time. And that was something new. I think in previous IPCC reports, there were these scenarios that went into negative territory. But now, because we are facing delays with decarbonization efforts, what is happening, I think, with the scenarios is that the decarbonization pathways are getting steeper, and the need for negative emissions to balance out any residual emissions is also increasing. And that became, I think, for the first time, I think, very obvious in that report. And basically, the science reached a consensus that there is no way around negative emissions if we want to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees. And that is really changing demand for carbon credits and voluntary markets, and also changing climate stewardship for corporates. And I'll get into that a little bit more, how corporates are translating this guidance that we see here on the slide to corporate pledges and reduction targets. Next slide, please. So yeah, so what we see, as a consequence of that IPCC report back in 2018, last 2 years there was a whole flurry of corporates starting to make pledges towards net zero. And as I said, this is really changing the demand in voluntary carbon markets. Interestingly, a lot of the net zero pledges by corporates and the targets they are defining include already removals, but not all of them. And I think Misha's presentation, he will go a little bit into more detail on this point. But I think the key message here is, if you look at only the certified B Corps, there are already more than 500 that committed to net zero by 2030. There are also very prominent alliances like this Transform to Net Zero alliance with very big corporates making net zero commitments. And that's, proliferating very quickly at the moment. Next slide, please. And I think the game changer in this net zero, if you go back to the IPCC and the need for negative emissions, if you go back to my first slide on your head, what that triggers now is, I think, this explicit need for negative emissions, or for what we call carbon removals. And this was not really there in the early days of carbon markets. In the past, people used to measure their carbon footprints and then try to reduce whatever they could, and then they would offset the rest. And when corporates bought carbon credits, they didn't really distinguish between an avoided emission or a removed emission from the atmosphere. And this is now changing. And I think going forward, carbon markets will have to make a more explicit distinction between these two concepts. And that's why I'm introducing them here in this slide. Avoidance basically means the avoidance or reduction of greenhouse gases in comparison to a baseline, typically defined on a project level. And if you look at the history of carbon markets, classic example would be renewable power generation by, for example, wind turbines, instead of the average power plant in a grid system, which would always have some form of fossil fuel energy in there. And this is, was the main concept around avoided emissions. And also, REDD+ or avoiding deforestation falls into that category as well. And the removals, they are essentially about removing CO2 from the atmosphere and then permanently storing this in either biological or geochemical things. So it would be, reservoirs, or another option is also to capture CO2 directly from the atmosphere and also permanently store it. All the natural things that we have, like forests or oceans, would not qualify as removal. So we're talking only about anthropogenic removals, or removals induced by human activity. Next slide, please. And if we think of the IPCC and these definitions, we try to show you here on the slide what that means for climate stewardship by corporates. So on the slide you see, the business as usual projections of a company, and then you see efforts that the company would try to undertake. And now I think, Ramon, I need to click on the slides. It's an animated slide, exactly. So the difference between the business as usual in this example here and the company gross emissions, these are, reflects the decarbonization efforts of a company. So whatever they can reduce on their own. If you click again, and I think one important message that we see also coming out of the Science-Based Targets Initiative is, this reduction pathway has to align with the 1.5 degree scenarios by the IPCC. So it has to be quite a steep decarbonization curve. And what we had in the past, and this is, illustrated by this climate neutral arrow here on the left. In the past, companies would simply offset their emissions, typically looking backward, what they emitted last year. They would then compensate with carbon credits, most of these credits being about avoided emissions. This was the concept of climate neutrality in the past. And now what we see happening is a transition towards net zero. So you need to click again. And what net zero basically means is looking at 2050, far into the future, the companies would have to achieve a state by 2050 where they reduced their emissions to basically a level of unavoidable emissions. And they have then to neutralize those unavoidable emissions with removal credits by 2050. And only then a company has actually achieved net zero. Until then, a company would be on a pathway to net zero. That's quite important. So usually this is about long-term targets. And what you see here in this slide is basically in line now with the latest paper by the Science-Based Target Initiative. And this combination of using offsets in the short term, like avoided emissions in the short term, while you are, reducing your emissions, and then over time transitioning to removals. This is what I think is the most ambitious kind of climate strategy by the Science-Based Target Initiative, was what they refer to as a climate positive strategy. But the big game changer now is that corporates are not looking backwards, how much they emitted last year and then just offsetting for that. They are typically now looking forward. And also they have to think about this removal purchase strategy and how they will procure these removal credits in the long run. And that is really changing supply demand dynamics in voluntary markets at the moment. Next slide. No. So, but then the question is, what qualifies as a removal? And there is still a big debate. And what you see here on the slide on the top, the three main approaches for removals. So we would have carbon capture and storage, or carbon capture and utilization approaches. And within this CCU space on the right, there is this concept of storage of CO2 in materials or in fuels, so the power to X. And on the left side, you see the different sources of CO2. So the CO2 captured can come from a fossil fuel source, from a biogenic source like biomass, or directly from the atmosphere. And the consensus, looking at how the IPCC defines removals and also what the corporates are defining this in their procurement at the moment. If you look at, for example, the example of Microsoft, what would qualify as a removal at the moment is only the green boxes. So we would be looking only at CO2 from biogenic sources or CO2 directly captured from the atmosphere. And classic CCS that would store CO2 from a fossil fuel source, like from a power plant, and store that underground, that would not qualify as a removal. That is basically part of a decarbonization effort of the power industry, for example. But there is still a lot of confusion, and even some lobbyists arguing, for example, for CCS for the top line here on this slide to be also to qualify as a removal. However, our opinion, and also going back to the IPCC, is that only the green boxes in this slide should qualify as a removal. And I think it will be increasingly important that carbon standards start making this distinction explicitly in their standards. Next slide. And here in this slide, you just see an overview of all the different project types that can achieve removals. There are purely, let's say, nature-based solutions on the left, things like reforestation, soil carbon sequestration, or biochar projects. Then in the middle, you have this combination between nature-based solutions and technological solutions, like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or BECCS. And then on the right side, you have the technological removals, which include technologies like direct air capture or CO2 to durable carbon, basically storage of CO2 in, for example, concrete products, for example. And on the left, these technologies are usually, or these approaches are less costly, closer to deployment, but they also face bigger risks of reversal or the permanence questions. If you think of forests, and forest fires, there are higher risks there on the left side. On the right side, on the technological spectrum, these are typically more costly, but in most cases actually less vulnerable to reversal. So that's, I think, just to give you an overview of the different approaches. Next slide, please. And that's my last slide. And we have been working quite a lot on removals and trying to meet the demand by corporates, this new demand by corporates around removals. And some of the things that we see and would advocate for going forward is first that this interest and enthusiasm around removals, and also I think a revival of the carbon credit market, that should not displace really deep decarbonization efforts. So that has to remain center stage. Then I think the second important point is that this demand for removals should not displace but complement the use of, let's say, the more traditional carbon credits that avoid emissions and contribute to sustainable development, in line with this climate positive approach by the Science Based Target Initiative. A good example here is stopping deforestation versus reforestation. It doesn't make sense to first lose all the forests and the biodiversity contained in that and focus only on reforestation. So I think first, we have to protect for example, the tropical forests that are still out there. One important thing that we need going forward is a coherent definition of carbon removals and the different standards. We will have to ask standards to start distinguishing between avoided emissions and carbon removals on the registry level, because this will be needed for corporates in order to really fulfill their net zero claims and be transparent about what they're buying and how they're using it. We need a lot of the project types that I showed before don't have dedicated methodologies yet, so these need to be created, and we will need also alignment across the different methodologies. And Southpool is working on a number of them. So I think a lot will happen next year in this area, but it's early days. And one area where we see also further work, something for IETA to pick up, I guess, is we will need alignment between voluntary markets and compliance carbon markets in relation to removals. I think both are showing interest, but we need to make sure that they support each other and don't overlap or conflict with each other. And with this wish list, I stop here and hand over back to Maria.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for that. It's very important to actually understand not only the role of removals in terms of meeting net zero targets, but particularly what are those different types of removal technologies, both in biological and geological, and then the role that carbon markets could play in scaling those technologies, along with that wish list, which it'll be great to work with everyone on this. What I'd like to then take to is bring in Misha, who can then show how Swiss Re is approaching the role of removals within their carbon net zero program. Misha, over to you.
Quick check, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, perfect. Screen is on as well, all fine, we're set.
Yes, please go ahead.
Wonderful. Just that you can see me, okay? I kept the whole IT department of Swiss Re in Zurich busy this whole afternoon to figure it out. They didn't, but that's fine. Then you can focus on the slides. So thanks a lot, South Pole, for inviting me to this event, and IETA for hosting that. Pleasure to present you what Swiss Re is doing, basically our journey towards net zero and how we define it and where we see the pain points, and elaborate a little bit why we are, intensively going around and tell people to do our best and remove the rest. That's a slogan that we coined, and you will understand what that is from Patrick's slides already, but we go a bit deeper. So the picture that I show you on the title slide is already kind of telling, because it shows Annette Bronder, who is our new group-wide COO. She stands here in front of Climeworks direct air capture facility in Hinwil, close to Zurich. And when she started a year ago, she really wanted to see with her own eyes what that is, what her team is telling her. Oh, we have to go net zero and operations first and business to follow. And then we took her there, and from then on, we had really great buy-in at the C-suite, the C-level. And therefore, I thought that it's worth sharing, that it's nice for corporates and decision makers to see such things tangibly in front of them. But we have other issues to solve. You've seen before a conceptual figure showing the same from Patrick. This is actually an IPCC projection, the P4 scenario, in the 2018 report that they brought. And it shows the net emissions path, the annual emissions, global emissions over time, and the net emissions path that goes through the zero line in 2050. That's when we are net zero. And then it's net negative even. So often we felt the perception in our own company and with other stakeholders that they think we have to reduce by 2050, and from then on we need negative emissions in order to get this purple line down beneath the zero line. That's why the negative emissions have to be there. So we can wait until 2030. But that's not the case, A, because we are walking on the business as usual path, obviously, still, and even more so since 2016, 17, when this scenario here was built. And B, we will have remaining gross emissions throughout the century. Science is very clear about that. And even we do unprecedented emission reduction efforts. Actually, it's really unprecedented. We have no idea how to basically get to these remaining gross emissions path that easily. So that's the do our best part, right? But you see now, in order to actually walk on the purple line with those remaining gross emissions, we need to build the capacity to remove the rest early on. So we have 30 years time to get us to a capacity of 10 to 20 gigatons of negative emissions per year in and after 2050. And I'll show you that just to highlight the scale of the problem that we're talking about here, which is often unnoticed. And what helps in the corporate world when we tell them, look, if you today take all the oil and gas out of the ground per year that we do, that emits 20 billion tons of CO2 per year. The rest is coal and land use change, right? And if you compare now the arrow sizes, exactly the same amount, 10 to 20 billion tons, need to be removed from the atmosphere. And I'm an engineer, so I can tell you, engineer-wise, it's a lot more difficult to get CO2 from a dilution of 0.04%, so from the atmosphere, out and concentrate it and store it permanently, than getting a hydrocarbon out of the ground and burning it in an internal combustion engine. So that shows you that we are talking similar scales. Or we can make the analogy, the carbon removal will be the next trillion-dollar industry, like oil and gas today. And then that's the latest moment when people start listening. And what I even say here is science-based growth projection for that industry is unprecedented. Science-based because if you assume that science is right with this scenario and that we will have to deliver those amounts of negative emissions, the growth from 0 to hero, so from 0 to 10 to 20 billion tons, is 60% per year, right? And nowhere in history there was an industry that grew at such a physical growth rate. So that's the scale of the problem. Quickly, the carbon removal 101, how we see it. You've heard there are natural solutions, hybrid, and technological solutions. We compare them via 3 indicators. First is the readiness or the affordability today, and you've heard natural solutions are clearly here in the win because we know how to grow a forest, right? Technical solutions are not, because so far there was no business case for that. It's a waste management problem that we are talking about. Currently, we dump CO2 in the atmosphere for free, and we know it's causing a problem and future generations will pay it, but we don't currently. Those costs are not internalized. So technically taking the waste out of the atmosphere again and getting rid of it properly, nobody wanted to pay it. So it's least advanced and it's still most expensive also because engineering-wise, I told you, it's very difficult to do. The second is the permanence of storage. And having a forest there for 300, 400, 500 years, it's anything but guaranteed, right? And we see that lately quite palpably with forest fires all over the planet. The hybrid and the technological solutions that can use more durable storage solutions, mostly the geological sphere, there we have pretty much, from a practical point of view, unlimited storage potential because it's thousands of gigatons of storage potential in the underground to put CO2 in dense form, as it's supposed to be done, for example, with direct air capture and storage in the deep underground. The third is scalability, and natural solutions here suffer because you know that they will compete for land and other resources like water, potentially even fertilizer. So if there is no tree today somewhere, there is no tree for a reason, because a human wanted to do something else, use the land, or even the speculation with it, right? So that's a bad and sad truth. They are not as scalable, right? At a certain point, we're running out of the resources that we need to grow biomass and let it be in its living form as a storage medium. Hybrid solutions are a bit better because they harvest plants, okay, or use plants to do the capture step, but you can regrow them after harvesting and converting them in a more durable storage form. And the technical solutions, again, basically the money is the limit. So once we have the willingness to pay for that waste management solution, we should not face severe scalability issues. There may be other constraints if we do things wrongly, but there is at least the outlook of being able to deliver gigatons of negative emissions per year for 50 years in a row with the technical solutions. And you see from this picture why my point is technical solutions are playing a very important role, just considering the sheer scale of the problem. So Swiss Re has a present focus on reductions, obviously, in operations in our core business, which is insurance offerings, and in asset management. Every insurance company is also an investor. In the future, we want to have separate targets for emission reductions and removals to tackle both problems at the same time. We have committed in operations by 2030 to net zero, and our business has signed the UN Business Ambition for 1.5 degrees pledge in order to get our insurance offerings to net zero together with the world by 2050, because we insure the whole world. Therefore, we need to kind of take the world on the journey, and we cannot just abandon the world by being earlier at net zero with our insurance offerings. So that's tough work ahead of us. Same for investments, probably a bit less tough, but also there, Swiss Re became a co-founder of the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance to commit to net zero portfolio from asset management by 2050. And now this logic was also interesting for our managers, top managers. If we have, to clean up our own house first, and we go and purchase the first carbon removal services, we become a credible partner for that emerging industry, and we can bring our underwriters and our asset managers to the same table, and thus access those new risk pools and asset classes with this new trillion-dollar industry. So focusing a little bit on operations, and I'll run quickly here. Basically, we had the greenhouse neutral program starting in 2003. And we started to buy these conventional carbon avoidance credits, or carbon offsets as they are called commonly, and we became climate neutral, as it was commonly known in the past or over the last 15 years. It was quite revolutionary then, because there was no carbon market as we know it today. However, under the current lens, knowing that we need actually to reverse those emissions, it's not enough. So if we emit a ton and cannot avoid it, we pay somebody else to avoid his or her ton. Our original ton will still end in the atmosphere. That's this little equation here on the bottom left. And clearly now, knowing what net zero actually is and that the net in there is so important, you see that this is incompatible with the net zero target. What you have to do if you're still responsible for positive emissions, you have to pay somebody to remove those. Then you are net zero, and that's actually also what SBTi tells us to do in order to claim net zero emissions. So what we do in order to address do our best, we have strict flight reduction targets introduced this year already pre-corona and next year facilitated through corona, and with the ambition to go even further down in flight emissions. That's our biggest chunk at Swiss Re. We're a financial institution. Flights are by far the biggest operational emissions. Then we have introduced as a first major corporate worldwide a triple-digit real internal carbon price. That means we collect the money and spend it. It's not just a shadow price that informs investment decisions. It's real money that flows here. And it incentivizes low carbon behavior and decision making throughout the company. So whatever buildings we go in, whatever flights we want to purchase, in the end, by 2030, we have the management committing to $200 per ton. So we have an increase from 100 next year to $200 by 2030. That is, to our knowledge, the strongest carbon pricing signal from a corporate to date. We use the funds to actually afford those carbon removal certificates that we consider to be of the high quality and of the promising ones, according to our three tiers criteria catalog that I've shown before. So this is showing you the price path again. So from 100 next year to $200 in 2030. These are our corresponding emissions with the minus 30% flight emission reductions already built in, and then assuming further reductions to say half, but that could well go down further. So emissions times the price gives us the money that we can spend eventually, or the financial impact that we will have on the company. In the past, we bought offsets, and we had a small flight levy, right? In the future, what we want to do is we want to phase out the high quality offsets and phase in the high quality removals. And high quality, as I said, these are the scalable, durable carbon removal certificates, or carbon removal solutions, and not necessarily monocultured tree plantations. Okay. We think it's important not to pull the plug of carbon finance to the good quality offsets, right? They have a justification. We're convinced that they will fade if Paris works and the ratcheting mechanism works and NDCs work. There will be no space for ITMOs, for transferring mitigation outcomes from one country to the other. But we believe that the corporate sector needs to face that equation that I've shown you and actually start affording high quality removals. And what we have here is now a 10-year planning horizon, so a locked-in price that is transparent and is high enough to buy those high quality certificates. And this is really a strong market signal for that emerging industry. And talking to the industry players, that's exactly what they need right now. Much more than capital or investments or angel money. They need off-takers. They need long-term off-taking agreements. So we're going to spend some 50 million with that program. It's not huge, agreed, right? The signals around are probably bigger than the actual sum that we spent. And this is in line with a remarkable development. Stripe probably was the first really loud announcement in August last year to say we're going to spend $1 million on particularly carbon removal. Shopify followed with 5 million. Microsoft followed with a fund that is 1 billion already in January this year. Jeff Bezos put 10 billion on the table, primarily for carbon removal activities as well. So you see how those numbers scaled quickly over the last month. Larry Fink was very much motivated by Microsoft's bold announcement, and he sent the letter to the CEOs that clearly calls for climate action for the first time, pronouncedly from a company like BlackRock. And then we saw many other net zero commitments coming up in this year particularly, right? Now there is a problem with those commitments mostly, or sometimes. We keep our own compilation because we've been working on it since more than the IPCC 2018 report. So we kept a close eye and always scanned whoever announces something around net zero and the definitions that are used, and this big jungle of words that are used and confusion. If you zoom into this column, it shows you that we check if a commitment that says net zero somewhere also mentions the need for negative emissions to get to net zero. And I can tell you more than half of those commitments don't. For example, the core B example that Patrick showed you before, they correctly define net zero, but then leave it to avoidance credits. That is fine, and say that brings you already to net zero, which I argue is not the case. And also, 4 out of 5 out of 11 actually founders of the Microsoft Alliance that Patrick showed also don't have a known net zero target yet. So there is a big bonanza here. We have to be very careful and wary of what people announce. And I really hope that the standards are now stepping in and define things properly, like SBTi just has done in September with their paper. So take home, that's my last slide. And before getting those, if you want to get those messages that I delivered in a very condensed 4-minute format, go to YouTube, Google Do Our Best, Remove the Rest. You get our animated explainer video on how we see net zero and how we think things should be done going forward. Take home message number 1 is that true net zero requires both reductions and removals. Reductions are always front and center, but it needs removals, otherwise you're not net zero. Ideally with separate targets and standardized claims, which is clearly not the case today. Then the below 2 degrees world needs climate leaders who are actually willing to pay the first mover price for high quality, scalable and durable removals, who don't wait and do free riding until the last year of their commitment to then say, and now we balance the unavoided emissions. And for corporates, I argue setting a stringent internal carbon price, a real levy, is a powerful tool to navigate your own net zero journey. Because first you incentivize reductions. You have actually a reason not to emit because it costs you a lot afterwards to compensate via removals. So it provides you then the dollars that you need for the removals. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Misha. That's really been helpful in terms of, one, also giving an overview on the murkiness of net zero claims that are being clarified as we go along, but also how a company can assess a $1 trillion market or trillions of dollars markets going forward and actually create an internal system using an internal carbon price to drive capital towards that way. So now we'll actually think about what are the key things to think about in thinking about removals. And so I'm going to give it to Adam Gray to talk about building sustainable carbon removal capacity. Thanks, Adam.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, Misha and Patrick, for your insightful introductory presentations before that, which I shall continue on the theme. So just wanted to spend the next few moments taking you through some of the work that the team at Foresight Transition in association with the Carbon Removal Centre have been doing to advance the awareness of carbon removal, capacity building, and how we can go about supporting the development of that key sector. Next slide, please. So I think it's quite clear in the presentations provided by Misha and Patrick that the scale of where carbon removal or negative emissions has to get to is colossal. The references to the scaling and size not dissimilar to or even bigger than the oil and gas sector. And by 2050, removing volumes of carbon dioxide that would be equivalent to the third of emissions that are produced currently is clearly a huge challenge ahead of us. And I guess what I wanted to focus on is obviously markets will play a key part in how that operates and moves forward and give potential signals and markers for direction. But it's going to take a clear amount of coordination across a huge amount of stakeholders. This is something that clearly is we're engaging with the biosphere and interacting with removals at such a scale that it's going to have impacts on a variety of countries, cultures, societies. And so for it to succeed, it really does need to have ensured that it's secured the long-term buy-in of all stakeholders. And I think that's the real key theme of what we're trying to emphasize here, that the challenge of trying to create this degree of supply projects, yes, it's going to take clever pioneers and brave and individual entrepreneurs to stick their head up and go forward with technologies or nature-based solutions, but it really does require the mobilization of wider sectors. And in particular, corporates are clearly a key element of that, both in the sense of them being emitters, but perhaps more so of interest the fact that they are so well connected with many of these wider stakeholders. So their ability to influence and to bring people along this journey and convincingly is going to be key. And we'll see that many of them are obviously finding their way through this very challenging and complex environment. But the key to that is about having informed and open dialogue and sharing of learnings as we go. And that really is the emphasis of what we see as the fundamental foundation that we need to make sure is in place and continues as we move forward on this gargantuan journey. Next slide, please. So as part of that, this is perhaps with a little UK focus to begin with, but equally the concepts apply globally. So a couple of years ago, there was an establishment of a carbon removal network, which was basically a gathering of a variety of different stakeholders and interested parties into the concepts of climate change and carbon removal, who would meet to share, discuss salient issues and seek to advance their understandings of their personal and organisational understandings of some of the key developments in the carbon removal space. This advanced with some of the members of that establishing the Carbon Removal Centre, which is a not-for-profit organisation established to really be a platform for the facilitation of project initiatives that would effectively advance the understanding and learnings of many of the aspects of carbon removal, not just confined to technologies, but looking at societal challenges and going beyond just looking at the classical sort of technical economic assessments, but looking at more holistically at some of these wider challenges. So that is an organisation that basically tries to work in partnership with many other organisations, such as the ones that we're here today with, South Pole and many others, that we're all seeking to strive for the same end goal of tackling climate change and looking in particular at how carbon removal plays a role within that. So we're keen to continue to cultivate that participatory and open engagement to advance this understanding. Next slide, please. So here's just really an outline of the concept of needing to build from, we're going from zero to a very embryonic sector to trying to build that up at the rates that we've heard from the previous speakers. And part of that is very much about establishing and building on this network to take forward some interesting initiatives and projects to provide findings that feed back into that network and wider learning. And one of those that I'd like to talk through now is the Corporate Carbon Removal Guide, which is being led in partnership with the Foresight Transitions. Next slide, please. So again, not to dwell too long on this slide, as I think both Patrick and Misha have covered what we've been seeing in terms of an explosion of interest and commitments and initiatives being taken by corporates. And certainly, as Misha described, those have varied very much in form, whether that be from internal carbon pricing proposals, whether it be through activities specifically with carbon market providers, a whole host of activity that is clearly very much needed and welcomed, and really does have the potential to be a catalyst to advancing the whole carbon removal space. But I think one of the bits that obviously that brings with it, we're currently in a void of policy and regulation, and there may be elements of that people see as good. It's not prescriptively constrained and duly at this stage, but that comes with the trade-off as well, that means people are having to forge their own interpretations and solutions that they see most appropriate and fit, and obviously that can give rise to challenges and impacts potentially unforeseen in the wider sector of society. Next slide, please. So I think that what we did as part of that is over the last 6 months or so, we've been engaging with a whole suite of corporates, many internationals from different sectors, hard to decarbonize, energy sectors or aviation, through to tech companies, service companies, food companies, to try to get a better picture of what their perspective is and the challenges that they're seeing in this environment, and also bringing to it as well the learnings that and communications that's taking place in the wider community, that in academia and the technology sector, which some of them may be very much aware of, others less so. And really what that's highlighted is that there's this clear almost compression occurring between pressures from the need for urgency and taking action. Early movers are taking action. Others are starting to think, right, what does that mean for me? How do we as an organization catch up with that? Hold on, are we hearing different signals coming from wider academic reports as to what is good or bad performance, etc. And they're really trying to work their way through that, whether it be in terms of understanding what's the right hierarchy of how to use some of these tools and credits available in context to carbon removal. What is the status of policy and regulation? Are there certain technologies that should they be trying to favour and support the advancement of engineering solutions? Should they be doing more for the engagement with readily available or earlier stage nature-based solutions, as we've heard from Patrick and Misha's presentations? So really, we're just at a stage of identifying that there is a clear need here for support to the corporate community in particular, noting obviously their importance in terms of bringing the wider communities along with them. So as a result of that, we've been producing and working on producing a corporate carbon removal guide. Next slide, please, which we hope will support that collaboration. I think just a few bits to point out on the guide itself. This is something that we've not created this in isolation. This is not an academic view of what or how should things be done. This is about engaging with corporates to understand some of the operational challenges and opportunities and risks that they're seeing, that they're wrestling with, to make sure that the guide seeks to address as best possible and raise awareness of some of these issues, so that then as similar projects may engage with policymakers or NGOs or wider communities, we'll be able to make sure that those issues are being raised and addressed in a coordinated manner. So as a result of, at the end of this, we have the guide we hope will form a useful platform for helping corporates to feel comfortable to be able to engage in an informed manner with the development of the carbon removal sector, and ultimately, to openly advocate appropriate use and best practice use of carbon removal within the wider climate strategies and commitments. Next slide, please. Thank you. So by the end of the year, the first release of the carbon removal guide will seek to have accessible tools, a range of them, from a glossary that will help try to decipher and bring into hopefully more accessible terms some of the complex lexicon that's used in the carbon removal space out there. It will try to clarify on some of the carbon removal techniques and some of the pros, cons, benefits, challenges, statuses of where some of these technologies are at, so that people can be comfortable and informed as to where the options exist. And it will work to sort of give options as how they might go forward with their strategy, in particular taking into account the current status of where governance is at, awareness of future long-term, currently as yet unknown or fully unresolved challenges that remain, so that really they can go forward with a clear, open mind and a considered science-backed base to development of their strategies. And we hope to be able to complete that with certainly a starter in terms of some recommendations for how companies can engage in the carbon removal strategies. So really truly access the catalytic capability that corporates bring. So to finish, clearly we've covered it's an absolutely massive task ahead, and we're going from a very embryonic state, and to do that we are going to need many stakeholders, corporates being your key one, corporates really do have this wider opportunity to influence and you know, have a responsibility in many ways to steward how this is taken forward. So it's important that they have access to the information that they feel is necessary, that they are engaged in being connected with companies that can respond to their needs and the gaps, and to really be comfortable to take that forward. And we'll continue to do that alongside other initiatives and projects sponsored and coordinated through the Carbon Removal Centre. And so just finish by leaving contact details there for people wishing to take that further.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Adam. I know that rarely there's a textbook written in life, but having something like this on carbon removals will be brilliant, and also having the opportunity to co-develop. So please do get in touch. I'm going to leave it now for Simon Henry to wrap it up with IETA's viewpoints here. Thanks, Simon.
Thanks, Maria, and thanks to South Pole for hosting this event, and to all the other speakers who've given fascinating presentations. In my wrap-up comments, I want to start by talking about the scale of the challenge, and I'm probably going to echo some of the comments that Misha and Adam have covered. But in the last year, we've seen net zero target announcements from a huge number of companies, but also a considerable number of countries. So we've seen announcements from South Korea, South Africa, Japan, and even China by 2060 to go alongside the EU's ambition. And of course, this is exactly what we want. This is very welcome news. But I'm also a little bit doubtful as to whether the scale of the challenge of delivering those net zero targets is really appreciated or fully understood. And you can see this. You can see this in the power sector. In Europe and in many other parts of the world now, we're at that stage where we are seeing the commercial deployment at scale of renewables, of wind and solar. And it's quite credible to think that in 10 years' time, 15 years' time, Europe will have a very low carbon power sector where renewables are the dominant source of electricity. But we have to remember that we've been working on this for 20 plus years. Research and innovation has been ongoing for a long time, and we've had very generous subsidy schemes, and we're only now at that stage of sort of mass deployment. And then we also think about that power sector emissions are maybe only a quarter of total GHG emissions, you know, and other sectors, transport, agriculture, industry, are all huge contributors to global emissions. And those sectors just don't have the low carbon solutions available at scale and at sort of cost competitive levels that we may have now in the power sector. So when we start thinking about net zero across whole continents within only 30 years, you know, the scale of the challenge really sinks in, I think, and it highlights that removals are going to be absolutely vital. There will be emissions in the system for the next 10, 20, 30 years. I think that's inevitable. And to get to net zero, removals are going to have to play a very significant role. The second reason I think that removals are absolutely necessary is that the goal, net zero, is obviously very important, but actually the pathway to get us there is almost as important. CO2 accumulates in the atmosphere and it stays there for a long time, and it's the driver of climate change. So a pathway to net zero where emissions decline rapidly now is better than a pathway where emissions remain high for a number of years and only decline, you know, rapidly as you get close to that target date. So removals are needed as soon as possible at scale because it can help deliver much greater net reductions than would be possible if we just focus on sort of the technological innovation and solutions. If we just look at the point source of emissions. So removals at scale are needed as soon as possible. And then the final point, or the final reason I think that removals are absolutely vital, is the credibility they bring to the whole climate package. And I think it's, you know, to see that level of transformation that is needed to get to net zero by 2050, 2060, it requires very significant and systematic changes across the whole of society, and it needs really everyone to believe that the target is achievable and that it will actually be delivered. And then when you look at the scale of the challenge, as I mentioned, it's quite possible that people will look at those targets and think it's too difficult, it's not going to happen, those targets are just words, and actually they'll be diluted, we'll miss them. But I think if there's a explicit recognition for removals, if we have legislation and frameworks in place to deliver them at scale, it starts to deliver real credibility to these targets, and you start to get that belief and buy-in to the transformation. And it could be that removals, the role of them is actually not very significant, because we do see real technological innovation and deployment in these industrial sectors. Or it could be that actually the role for removals is very significant, because those technological solutions don't emerge at scale in time. But having an explicit recognition of removals will demonstrate that policymakers are very serious about net zero, that this is what is going to happen. It's not just words. This is the outcome of where we'll be in 2050 or 2060. And then when you get that belief, when you get that buy-in, you start to see a sort of a positive feedback where consumers, business owners, investors, they all start to change their behavior. They all start to understand that the change is happening, and they make changes themselves. And all of a sudden, net zero becomes inevitable, because everyone is bought into the process, everyone is bought into the transformation. So I think having an explicit role of removals, helps to deliver the belief and the credibility in those targets. So just to wrap up, I think removals will be needed, because the scale of the challenge is huge, and they help deliver that credibility. And I think they're needed as soon as possible, because the pathway to net zero is almost as important as the target itself. And I'll pass back to you now, Maria.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to go straight into polls. So there's been a lot of questions coming in, and these polls are meant to just kind of get the audience going, audience consideration. So in terms of carbon removal, should it be defined as activities that capture and store carbon from atmospheric or biogenic sources only? Which would you say, should it be yes, no, or you don't know? We'll just give a few more seconds for people to consider that question. Just waiting for enough answers before we show the results. All right, yes, almost not unanimously, but a good amount, so 71%. That's great. Could we go to the next question, please? And then the second question is, should carbon standards make an explicit distinction between carbon removal credits and avoided reduced emission credits? And this actually plays to a lot of the questions that have been asked by the audience, so it's a good time for you to weigh in. And definitely that's almost unanimous that there needs to be this kind of distinction. So what I'd like to bring back is all our panelists and to give a first reaction to those findings. So definitely, and what I'd actually kind of combine it with is this question that we've been getting from the audience of not the fear, but the concern that if we were to put in removals, it could actually move the ideas away from avoided emissions, and then also tied to that, it could create some perverse incentives where something that Patrick mentioned earlier, which is you cut down forests that are already existing and then actually reforest it. with that in mind, I guess I would ask the panel, what are some key things we need to put as safeguards to ensure these kinds of perverse incentives don't happen, including labeling of avoided emissions versus removals? I think I'll start with Patrick, since he had brought this up early in his wish list.
Sure, yeah. So I think that's indeed a concern, that because of this, let's say the most pure definition of net zero, that basically means very steep reduction pathways combined with removals. We see that already in some targets by corporates like Microsoft, for example. They decided to move straight from the traditional credit types to removals, and that's creating a whole new demand for example, reforestation projects, which are the cheapest form of removals at the moment. And while reforestation is needed as a part of the solution, and there is no right or wrong, we need all of these things. That can create a little bit of a distortion and reduce, I think, the demand or the interest in avoided deforestation, for example. And one thing that we also often forget when talking about avoided emissions, the biggest growth in emissions going forward is going to come from developing countries and growing economies like Africa or Asia. And these countries are also the places where we need the most of the investments going forward. So if you think of carbon credits as a climate finance instrument, this is where they can play a crucial role in putting these economies on a greener path. And by focusing on removals only, we may miss that opportunity as well. So that's, I think, one thing. That's why we argue, you should combine both, and you should, be always climate neutral and support these traditional avoidance projects on your way to net zero. And eventually, you have to transition from the offsets to removals. But we have this 2050 timeline in mind always, right? So it's a very long process, and some corporates are making that switch already now in 2020, which is good in some cases, but if everyone would do it, I think we would have a problem.
Thanks. I think all our audience saw that, so I'm going to go next to Adam in terms of the guide. Any findings there?
Yes, yeah. So, I mean, obviously we're due to finish towards the end of the year, but clearly some of the initial findings that have come out has been the diversity of where corporates are at in the challenges of this. An interesting area in particular is combining really with the sustainability aspects of, as we were just touching on there with the carbon removal credits piece. Clearly some corporations have a preference or erring towards a preference of certain types of carbon removal within their processes because they feel it's potentially a better fit with their core activities. So, we might see, for example, food companies have more of an interest potentially in terms of nature-based or land-based solutions, whereas other more engineering ones may be favouring sort of direct air capture. And I guess coming back to this point of the portfolio need, that is something that is required across the spectrum. So a way of trying to help organisations realise that portfolio effect is good, while still managing to direct funding to the projects that are going to need more support further down the line that will bring the costs of those down and make them more accessible is also important. So I think we are seeing that there are different preferences, but they can actually match some of the needs as well that will be required to achieve this portfolio. So that's clearly one of the themes. Lots of questions and concerns really as well about the clarity of or concerns about taking actions that in the absence of detail could subsequently be undermined as regulation catches up or standards come into play. So a little bit of chicken and egg is definitely one of the features that we're seeing out there with people. So yeah, a lot of sympathy for a lot of complex challenges that people are trying to get their head around, both in terms of doing the right thing, but also trying to see how that plays into a corporate business case, bearing in mind they've come, people have got used to the concepts of emission reductions and mitigation, and that was relatively straightforward in the sense that it came quite naturally with a business case as well. You were typically reducing emissions, saving energy costs, etc. So that worked nicely. When you're then looking into the removal space, it's obviously a little harder to make the complete business case of that, and that's something that corporates are also scratching their heads and trying to get comfortable with.
Thanks. With Simon, actually, I would love your perspective on that balance between avoided and removals, but also in terms of looking at policy and markets. So what are some of the ways in which policy can ensure that kind of alignment and balance?
Sure, yeah, and I can see there being value in differentiating between avoided emission units and removals, and it should be quite a simple thing actually for the main standards to implement, because all these units come from certain methodologies. It's easy to work out if it's an avoided methodology or a reduced, a removal methodology. But I suppose I would caution a little bit about developments such as that. One of the challenges the voluntary market has faced is the fragmentation we have. So we have different standards, a whole range of different project types, and a huge range in prices, varying from a few $cents for some units up to $20 maybe for charismatic projects. And that has made it challenging to scale the market. IETA, and I know South Pole are part of this Mark Carney-led task force that produced their recommendations document yesterday. And one of the things they're talking about to scale the market is to harmonize it, try to standardize the products, standardize the approaches, and that will attract finance at a much greater scale. So if we then fragment the units down into another layer between avoided and removals, we may actually prevent some of that standardization that could lead to a scaling. So it's an interesting idea, but we need to think about some of the knock-on impacts it may have, or the unintended consequences it could have as well.
Thanks. And I'll leave it for Misha to answer this question, which is, if we were, drawing on what Simon said, that we could have offset prices that are way too low in the voluntary market to actually support the kinds of costs that would be needed to scale removals technologies as a carbon credit, what would be the things that you would focus on to actually enable the carbon markets to provide that kind of financing? Or is it too early right now?
Yes, I mean, the biggest challenge that we have is the big gap between, a high quality removal and the classical carbon avoidance credit currently. If you're in a US corporate, it's already quite a big step to go from a $1 credit to a $15 credit, right? While we are trying here, buying a little bit of more expensive avoidance credits for all the co-benefits, I don't see it easily that a lot of people like Stripe or Shopify or soon Swiss Re will go to a $500–600 per ton removals credit. And this is eventually what we need, because we need to get those technologies, those prices down to say still a triple digit, but certainly not, they cannot come down to a $15 credit at the current deforestation credit costs. This is the only thing that I see there is more and more of the front runners, like the usual suspects that we heard now, and need to provide these examples such that there is a second layer of companies who do it, and we should not, as front runners, just refer to the importance that we also need avoidance credits. That's absolutely correct, and I'm actually quite happy how SBTI handles that. They just simply say we need to go down, we do abatement, so reduce our own emissions. In the last year, we need to balance that with negative emissions. And in what you do in between, as long as you're in the science-based target reduction path, is basically for the world to follow you, and not really for you to get somewhere. First and foremost on your net zero transition is to reduce in line with science. Second condition is at the end of the period when you want to claim net zero, you need to have 100% removals, no space for avoidance credits anymore. And what you do in between is up to you. It's left up to you. I argue then scenario 5 is a bit smarter because it has a separate target for removals as well, and it's not just a last year target, which will make it very hard to get the $500 per ton down, right? So if we have more of these examples, where, you know, like Swiss Re is doing, we say we pay on average now 100. That allows us to buy a small share of the $500 credits, and we compensate, or we balance that with you know, some high quality offsets that we currently buy at $10, $15, so that on average we land at 100. I think that's a role model that could work, and slowly but surely we increase the amount of the high quality removals in the compensation mix, and that brings down, if more people do that, that brings down the cost overall. Hope that's understandable. Sorry, I have my 2 kids around because we're over time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And it's always wonderful to have kids around. This is the whole point we're doing this, is to make sure they have a future. So exactly. I'm going to leave that there. Actually, it's a very good note to know that removals, while at an inception stage, actually does need front runners, and it needs front runners from not just the corporates, but policymakers and enablers to think about what is the market that would enable this kind of technology. It's obvious we need it. It's obvious that the scaling, both technologically and financially, needs to occur, but it's also obvious that we need to make sure that environmental safeguards are in place to ensure the environmental integrity of the entire system. So we've presented a whole group of people here who are really thinking about this. I encourage you to engage with us at South Pole and with all the speakers who are involved. And we look forward to looking at how removals can play a role in net zero going forward. Take care, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and looking forward to joining the conversation. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.